Hey everyone, welcome back to Vegan Books. I'm Kathleen, and I can almost hear some of you saying through the wires, so to speak, well, Kathleen, after your last video, I can say almost anyone can make a beautiful vintage junk journal with authentic papers and real ephemera. But I'm hampered with a strict budget, and there is no antique store in my tiny town. Yeah, I sympathize with that. I also live in a tiny place with a thrift store, but they don't often have really great things. And lots of antique stores around here, but they're also very pricey. So I understand the challenge. And so today I want to talk about the best affordable vintage style junk journal supplies. I'm glad you're with me, and I hope you'll stay clear to the end. Okay, first up is paper. You just almost can't create a vintage junk journal without some great paper. But here are some affordable options that give you that aged, old-fashioned look. Okay, so let's talk first about coffee dyeing. So coffee dyed paper is really the foundation for most of our vintage style junk journals, and it's easy to coffee dye, and I'm not going to do that on camera because there are 1,000 videos out there about how to coffee dye paper and different ways too. So if one way doesn't work, then please, keep looking, because you'll find a method that works for you. It's simple, it's cheap, it gives a beautiful aged effect, and there are just lots of tutorials available from talented creators. So go look for how to coffee dye. And there is also avocado dye. And then there's cabbage dyeing, which gives you this pretty blue or kind of a purple effect. So there's all of these videos out there. So do a search on how to do some of these vegetable dyed papers or eco dye. That would be something really fun too in a vintage junk journal. Right? And also don't forget to dye things like index cards or other kinds of paper. Coffee will be your best affordable aging supply. Okay, secondly, let's talk about old book pages. So that's the other thing that's very affordable. You can often get a book at the Salvation Army or another type of thrift store for just $1, maybe even sometimes less than $1. And then that paper is naturally aged and looks really good in a junk journal. So one of my favorite book page type papers is music paper. There are a lot of people in this country, who took piano lessons and then never did anything with it. There are a lot of pianists out there who have died, and their children have come through, cleaned out the piano bench, and sent it all to the thrift store. So you can often find music paper, and it makes great pages for your junk journal. It also makes fun pockets. So that's the other thing I want to do in this video, is not to show you a bunch of supplies, but show you how you can use those supplies. So this is just an example of a piece of music paper, and I have folded it into thirds in a Z fold this time, folded this down, and then folded this side. On this side, I would glue it here, glue it there, so that there's a little pocket here, and glue it here so that there's a little pocket here, and then just use a little bent paper clip. And then I have a double floating pocket, we call it. It just gets clipped onto the side of the page. So these are some of my favorite book pages to use. Just old historical books are one of my favorites, because then you can get sometimes these old pictures of things. So So you can use that as a piece of ephemera, or you can use it as a page in the journal, and it just adds to the aged kind of effect. So these oversized history books are often a really good find in the thrift stores. I also look for books that have big indexes because I like these tiny prints that just, you can't hardly read it. It just becomes a design in the background. And the paper is good. And yeah, I like indexes for all kinds of things. This is just a craft book, needlepoint or cross stitch, one of them. Lots of times you can get old pattern books for crochet and some of the historical kinds of crafts like tatting or knitting. This is out of an encyclopedia for illustration. It's one of my best tear books, and it just has these old-fashioned botanical illustrations, and those make great pages. Okay, so the other part, my favorite part of a tear book, are the end papers. So here's an example of one of the flyleaf pages that it's often vintage or aged, and it kind of adds some color to the signature. But these are also end pages, and sometimes they're blank, sometimes they'll have, you know, just the title. But these papers are often foxed and stained sometimes, or written on, and those are really kind of fun, authentic papers that you can use either for ephemera to stuff in a pocket, or I like to use them as shorts in the signature. And sometimes I just print on them a quote, or do stamping on them, because the paper is authentically vintage, and so then it just feels truly authentic. Okay, so don't overlook music books, dictionaries, encyclopedias. Gardening books are really good, so keep your eye out for those naturally yellowed books. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is old maps. You might even have one of these under the seat of your car. It might not be old, but you can find really great old maps in thrift stores. And I always check the used books for old vintage atlas. Maps make great printed designs for pockets or paper. This is an example of a Z-fold pocket. I did this in one of my last journals. We'll just take this as an example. This is the way this would fit in the journal. I would glue this down, and that would be a pocket, and then this folds over, and that's journaling here on the back. So that's the way I would use a map in a vintage journal, one way. And you'll find that different maps have different colors, and yeah, it makes it really fun. This is an old National Geographic map, so it's largely blue with these pretty vintage colors. Okay, and then finally, you don't want to overlook just the paper pads, the scrapbook paper pads. And I try to get, because I do mostly vintage journals, I always look for the vintage style patterns, like this Paper Studio, which is a Hobby Lobby brand. This says tattered and worn. So, and I wait until they go on sale, because I never pay full price. This one is also fun. This is a little bit more, it's vintage, but it has a little bit more color in it. So vintage doesn't have to be, you know, muted, but it often is. This is another one that has really great papers. This one is, you know, been picked over several times, but this heirloom pad, Park Lane, comes from Joann's, Theodosia Square. This is one of my favorite pads, and I have a new one of this one. And yeah, so these are the pads that I've had to replace because I've used them so often in my journals. So don't overlook the scrapbook papers. And then of course you can use digitals. And I'm not here today to have an argument with anyone about using digitals or not using digitals. I use them. I even mix them. And we don't have to even have a discussion about that because remember, junk journaling is personalized and you can do it any way you want. Okay? All right, here's another couple book pages. I forgot I made notes. Yeah, the #1 affordable resource for vintage junk journal is paper. So focus on paper and you'll be halfway there. #2 is ephemera. And this is where vintage style often gets really expensive when you're actually buying vintage ephemera. That can get expensive. So I have lots of vintage ephemera. It's kind of what I spend my money on when I can afford it. But it is pricey, and you can make a vintage junk journal without it. But having real ledger or real receipts or other kinds of ephemera, I think is just really fascinating. Here is a vintage pad of note paper that I got somewhere, not even sure. And I will list my favorite sources for ephemera online in the description, but today I want to show you options that are handmade real or that look vintage, that not necessarily are vintage. And again, we'll go back to something like coffee dyeing. So you can coffee dye things like index cards or modern guest checks. These are some other index cards, and that makes them look vintage. And so then you can create ephemera on top of that, and it still helps your journal to be in the vintage style. Some of the other things that you can look for to help you make ephemera vintage is things like these reproduction. This is a reproduction catalog for Montgomery Ward's, and so you get all of these little images and papers that you can tear and cut. Even the Workbasket magazine, it's out of print now, but this one is as recent as 1986, but the pages have yellowed, and so the ads, you know, I often will do something like this. And I actually have a video. This was a mass make I did a long time ago now, but I just have cut different ads from these old magazines and then used watercolor and some gesso, some texture stamps to make this piece of ephemera. This could go in a vintage junk journal easily. And so look for old craft magazines in the thrift store, and then use these kinds of things, the text or pictures, in your ephemera making. Okay, so something like this, so you can cut that out, and that would make a really cute piece of ephemera. You could also make little clusters with just all kinds of scraps of different vintage looking ephemera. And of course, Tim Holtz is a great friend of the Junk Journaler because he produces all these little things that make ephemera making so much fun. And you can, you know, print it out. You can just, there are so many free vintage printables available online. Free ephemera blogs offer things like postcards or tickets and labels. You just need a printer and some basic cardstock. Okay, and then don't overlook napkins. Vintage looking napkins. This is a collage napkin, and it looks very vintage. So you can do some napkin decoupage with these pretty kinds of floral or other kinds of prints, birds, botanicals, and they look very vintage once you get them done. Okay, and again, digital images can help you create a vintage look. All right, now don't overlook stamp collections. I think postage stamps are one of the best affordable, really vintage ephemera. You can get these collections of vintage postage stamps for not very much money, honestly. So I'm actually going to do a separate video at some point about using postage stamps in a junk journal. But you can see I've made these two little pieces of ephemera on coffee dyed index card. I just have a piece of dyed sellotape, Scotch tape, or transparent tape. I don't know what you call it in your neck of the woods, but you can do that dyeing yourself. And then I've just used some vintage dictionary and a couple of stamps. And so you can make vintage ephemera pretty easily. So don't overlook postage stamps. And then, as I say, old magazines and newspapers. I had a whole stack of newspapers given to me by a woman who was cleaning out the shed from a neighbor, and she dropped those off, and so now I have old paper that I can use in collages and ads to make little cards. Yeah, so it's available, it's out there. You just sometimes have to kind of pay attention and listen to your neighbors and what they're saying. And then there's things like old greeting cards. Now this is a new greeting card. It's actually in 2007. And I just cut the front off, discarded the rest. But this is a classic kind of vintage floral picture. And so I can do a little bit of distressing on here and turn that into either a journal card or a pocket in a journal, and it will look perfectly vintage. And then of course you have new ones. This you can buy right now at Dollar Tree. It's a very vintage looking image. And so if I cut that down and distress it a little bit, it makes a perfectly vintage looking ephemera piece. And then of course there are actually at the thrift store, quite often you can find old vintage greeting cards, and they're usually often folded like this, and so you get all that journaling space and this lovely image. Or I could even just cut it up and use each of those 4 little images on other ephemera, cut this up. Yeah, you can often find these greeting cards that are easily vintage at the thrift store, but also from friends or neighbors whose elderly parents are downsizing or have died and they're going through their papers. People save greeting cards, and so it's a really easy way to get some vintage illustrations in your junk journal. Likewise with old postcards. So you can get old postcards at the thrift store, or you can tell your friends and neighbors what you're trying to do, and maybe they have a little collection of postcards and they don't want to save them anymore, and so they're happy to give them to you. So you can use either the picture side, but I often like to just use the other side, this writing side, and create ephemera doing that. So it doesn't really matter that, you know, this is a modern postcard. It just becomes kind of the backdrop for something like this. One of my favorite things to do is to emboss a postcard and then sand it. You've seen me do that a number of times. Okay, so we've covered paper and ephemera. Now let's talk quickly about texture and embellishing. And the easiest way to do that is to look for vintage fabrics. And they don't have to be actually vintage, but just look for the ones that look old-fashioned and vintage. This is a fabric sample, and but it's very vintage looking. That you can, even in the fabric stores now, you can buy vintage patterns for calico and muslin. So look for lace, old curtains. In the thrift store, you can look for lace in clothing, blouses, dresses. I showed this in my last video. This is lace that comes from the Dollar Tree, and it's off-white, and I often coffee dye it or dye it another color. But it doesn't have to be actually vintage. You can make it look aged and vintage, and that will also help you create a vintage junk journal. This is just some cotton lace that was off of a vintage-ish garment, but that would make a really pretty belly band, I think, in a journal, and it would be very vintage, especially if I coffee dyed it or tea dyed it. Yeah, so in my last video I showed this little doily and told you I would make that into a pocket on a page. I would just take this and do something like this on a page, and then this would be the pocket. But in case you can't find a doily that would work like that, that's why I cut this lace into a circle. You can do the same thing just by cutting up an old curtain. You can just fold that top over and glue that on, and then you get the same look. Same thing with this piece of lace. That just gives you another little pretty little pocket in a vintage journal. And the other thing is to look out for things like buttons and trinkets. So you can get whole jars of vintage buttons at the thrift store for not very much money. And you can get these vintage looking kinds of trinkets just in the craft stores or wherever. If you put this, so I cut this down from the flyleaf paper. So now I have this piece of paper, and then I just used another little printed piece and then pushed, this is a little brad, and I just pushed it through to the back and then folded that down to cover the brad, the prongs, and that makes kind of a nice little journal tag. I started with a coffee dyed index card here, and I just took some lace, some scraps, and a couple of little buttons, some stamps, which we'll talk about in a minute, and just some other kinds of string. This was some jute twine, and made this piece of ephemera. So a ball of string used to be on every kitchen counter. You can get twine at any of the craft stores for a couple of bucks, and bonus points if you can find the jute twine, because that gives you kind of a more rusty vintage look. So string and twine can be used in so many ways. You can bind the journal, you can tie on tags, you can crochet the page edge, you can do messy embellishments. So, and then lastly, I wanted to talk about the faux sellotape or scotch tape. It's easy to make with a bit of alcohol, and even brown shoe polish can be smeared on regular cellophane tape. So I just get it at the Dollar Tree, and then I just use the dies to make this aged tape. All right, so we've talked about paper, ephemera, and texture and embellishing. So the last thing I want to talk about is my favorite tools. My favorite tools, don't overlook things like this either. Okay, so this is just funny old paper that you can get at the thrift store in the patterns, pattern tissue, pattern instructions, craft books. All of those have often really great paper that's kind of fun to put into vintage junk journals. Okay, so my favorite tools. First of all, Distress Oxide Vintage Photo. This is my favorite distressing ink. And I know lots of people use all kinds of things, but I just learned how to use this when I first started junk journaling, and I've never looked back. The reason why I like the oxide is I like the way there are colors underneath the brown. And so when you put water on it or try to distress it in other ways, liquid ways, then those colors sometimes come out really interesting. The yellow particularly I like in vintage photo. But this helps distress. I'm calling it a tool, but it's really more of just an essential supply. These inks are really great for aging the edges of your paper, giving your ephemera a more rustic look. And so the Ranger Tim Holtz is the popular brand, but there are other affordable alternatives out there. Okay, the next thing is rubber stamps, acrylic stamps. You don't need a huge collection, just a few good ones. You know, floral designs or these vintage patterns, scripts. Script is really good. You can find these at craft stores or online, but be sure to check secondhand stores because lots of people will donate their unused craft supplies. So you can find rubber stamps at the thrift store for really cheap. And then stencils. Stencil is an inexpensive tool, and they're available in many different stores. You can even cut your own. But stenciling is a time-tested way to add vintage charm to any flat surface, furniture, but especially in a journal page. So look for ones with geometric designs. These open ones are particularly hard to store because they get caught on everything. But geometric designs are great. This one with Tim Holtz is an alphabet, a font, and that's kind of fun. Something like this with some texture paste or just stenciling along the edge of a card, that really helps things look vintage and classically vintage. Okay, finally, scissors. Just a regular pair of scissors you can use with paper and just kind of rough up the edges of a card, just there in the V. That helps kind of create this rough edge. You can also use these decorative scissors. This is a decal edge, and so that just cuts that classic vintage decal edge. And then you can have something like a tear ruler. And this is a tear ruler that I've made myself, and I have a video about that, so I will link all of these videos that I have shown. Examples I will list in the bottom, but this just helps you kind of tear this pretty deckled edge. I love that. So there you have it. These are my best suggestions for affordable supplies for creating beautiful vintage style junk journals. You don't need to spend a lot to achieve that old-fashioned charm. Just be a little creative and exercise some resourcefulness. And let me know in the comments what your favorite affordable supplies are. Share with your fellow junk journal makers, and don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell for more creative tips and tutorials. Check the description box for the links to the videos of some of these ephemera pieces that I have made, other videos that might be helpful. And thanks for watching. Happy journaling, and I'll be back with the next project.